Hi all, I'm Raphael, or Raph, and I'm an accessibility and usability consultant for AbilityNet, which is a pan-disability UK-based charity. And I'm going to be talking to you today about inclusive design, how it differs from accessibility, and I'll also give you some tips for how you can embed inclusive design into projects that you're working on. Yeah, before start talking about inclusive design, it's important to consider what accessibility means first. So accessibility is a term some of you may be familiar with. Who would say you have a reasonable idea about what accessibility means? Yeah, quite a few of you. Well, this is a quote from Tim Berners-Lee, inventor of the internet, and says, "The power of the web is in its universality, accessed by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect." Now, take note of the word access. We won't take this quote out of context, but access is a theme that we'll come back to. Under the Equality Act in 2010, it says you're disabled if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. Now, disability sort of definitions can get a bit social and political. I'm not going to go into those today, but the Equality Act is important and affects any of us designing services in the UK. We used to have the Disability Discrimination Act, and this was replaced by the Equality Act in 2010. And I'll just give you a moment to read this quote from it. "The duty to make reasonable adjustments requires service providers to take positive steps to ensure that disabled people can access services. This goes beyond simply avoiding discrimination." Now, you'll notice that it says reasonable adjustments, and the interpretation of this is generally that it depends on the context. If you're a bank, a utility service, or a council, for example, you'd be expected to go to much further lengths than, say, an independent craftsman making knitted finger puppets. So the context, depends on, obviously, sort of your means, the resources available to you, how much money you've got, and who you're providing services for. According to the Family Resources Survey in the UK, nearly 1 in 5 people have a disability in the UK, and this amounts to over 13 million people. This number can go up, of course, to ageing population and so on, but we deteriorate as we get older, often picking up chronic illnesses, and this can lead also to not just sometimes permanent disabilities, but short-term illnesses as well. But we can all experience short-term illnesses or have an accident which could lead to a temporary disability. So, for example, I could break my dominant right hand playing ice hockey, and I might then find it difficult trying to use a mouse. Most disabilities are also hidden, and difficulties too can be hidden, and so not apparent to the casual observer. So you could spend time with someone you'd never met and not know that they had dyslexia, for example. So where do we start with accessibility? The starting point for a lot of companies and organisations is with guidelines. The World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, produced the most sort of internationally recognised accessibility guidelines called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and these are usually referred to as WCAG. Now, in June last year, WCAG 2.1 was released, and this was sort of nearly 10 years after the previous iteration, 2.0. And they cover another number of what they call success criteria. It gives some good advice on how to make things accessible. But I have a sort of love-hate relationship with the guidelines. If they didn't exist, I think some companies would honestly do little or nothing at all with accessibility. But they are updated quite slowly. It's a volunteer-run organisation. The newer guidelines, they do have some good new ones which focus particularly on some mobile upgrades as well, because in 2008, which was when 2.0 came out, that was only a year after the iPhone was released, and that obviously changed a lot of things with mobile technology. But apart from them being updated slowly, I don't know if any of you have tried reading them, but they are quite difficult to read. They're very technically written, and They also have to be testable, and by being testable, it means that they're sort of more focused on the technical aspects of web accessibility. And what does that mean, testable? Well, as I said, they have a number of what they call success criteria. And one of them, for example, is about keyboard accessibility. Content that you should be able to interact with using a mouse also has to be operable using a keyboard. Another one is about the markup of text for screen reader users. And so one of them in particular is around foreign language and making sure that if you have a page in English and you have this phrase in French, it would need to be marked up with a French language attribute. Otherwise, a screen reader would probably try and announce it as most English people would speak French or try to speak French terribly. These guidelines are quite easy to sort of come up with testable guidelines for, though. Whereas when it comes to cognitive disabilities, it can get much harder. And that's why, as I said, some of the guidelines are more focused on specific disabilities, particularly with low vision and blindness, for example. So you can come up with more sort of testable guidelines when it comes to cognitive disabilities, but because cognitive disabilities covers such a wide spectrum, it is much harder, and there hasn't been nearly enough research in this area. Let's say you had a cluttered interface, though, and it was difficult for someone with autism to use. Some examples earlier showed some cluttered interfaces. That can obviously present a big challenge, and this wouldn't, at the moment, sort of fall under guidelines that most people are following. I mentioned access, and that I'd come back to it. Access doesn't equal good user experience. If you think of an example, a London Tube would do. Just because people can technically access something doesn't mean they're actually going to enjoy using it. And now, if you think about this in terms of websites, let's say that you've put captions onto videos on your website. It might mean that thousands or perhaps even millions of people can now technically access the captions. And for people who are hard of hearing or deaf, that's of course incredibly important. But let's say that those captions are actually out of sync. And on the screen, they're out of sync with the people talking. That's obviously not a very good user experience. And if people have a choice, it's a good chance that they might either just close the video, or if they have an option, they might use another website competitor instead. With inclusive design, we need to start thinking about it slightly differently and more along the lines of the sort of social model of accessibility. Rather than thinking of someone as disabled because of their disability, we need to think of it as being disabled by the environment that they find themselves with. So with inclusive design, a key theme really is about looking at disabilities as a mismatch of human interactions. And what I'd like to do now is just a very quick exercise. I'd like all of you to just try and think of a time where either you or someone you know well has been disabled by the environment or the situation they've found themselves in, either because of a permanent, a temporary, or a situational disability. Well, this is from Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit, and it nicely illustrates how we can all be disabled. Someone with one arm has a permanent disability. Someone who's broken their hand playing ice hockey, for example, has a temporary disability. And a parent who's, for example, holding their child on their dominant arm is situationally disabled if they're trying to use their free hand for something. I'll just finish this part by just giving this quote from the British Standards Institute. They say that the design of mainstream products and or services that are accessible to and usable by as many people as reasonably possible, without the need for special adaptation or specialised design. And you'll notice that it says without the need for specialised design. I've sometimes been asked questions from clients, can't we have an alternative website purely for people who have visual impairments? That's not inclusive design, that's coming up with a separate service. So what we need to be doing is making sure that what we design and develop is as inclusive to as many people as reasonably possible. And I'll give a case study. We've talked a little bit, and a few talks today, about captions. when done right, they're a very good example of inclusive features. And it may or may not surprise you that a lot of people, most people actually, who use captions aren't actually hard of hearing or deaf. Ofcom did some research in 2006, and of the 8.5 or something million people who were actually using captions, there's only 20% of them who had a hearing impairment or deaf. A lot of people use captions in all sorts of situations today. I don't know if any of you perhaps have used captions when you're on a busy train. It's noisy, for example. Perhaps at an airport as well, you've had examples where captions have been useful. What let's do now is actually just go through a few examples of how you can actually embed inclusive design in some projects. But just before that, I think it's important to point out that this is unfortunately where a lot of companies first consider accessibility right at the last moment of processes. And I've had clients in the past approach me sort of two weeks before launch of a website or app, asking how they can make their website or app accessible. And of course that's far too late. It then becomes a sort of bolt-on exercise and an afterthought. The reasons for this can change quite a bit. Sometimes it's a lack of maturity within a company or organisation when it comes to accessibility. Sometimes it's down to poor internal processes. Other times, unfortunately, it's down to some companies seeing accessibility as a sort of box-ticking exercise and feeling they're only doing it because they sort of have to, sometimes because they don't want to get sued. So regardless of whatever framework that you're using, we need to be considering inclusive design and accessibility throughout research, design, and testing. And this means from before even the inception of a new idea, starting to talk about it early on, having an accessibility statement and vision, and then making sure that teams have the training and tools they need to make sure it is embedded throughout. So moving on to a few sort of tips, I suppose. I'm sure everyone in this room knows how important user testing is. We've talked a lot about putting customers at the heart of what we do. And with user-centered design, a key part, of course, involves making sure that we test things with our customers and users. And this also, of course, means having people with diverse access needs as well. I can't stress enough how powerful it is having people in with user testing sessions who have different access needs, sometimes using assistive technology. You'll learn an awful lot. I don't think there's ever been a time where I've done user testing where I haven't learned something from people with different access needs who are reliant sometimes on assistive technology that I don't use myself, even if I'm familiar with testing with it. It's also incredibly powerful for senior stakeholders when they see someone firsthand with different access needs, struggling with their baby that they've been working on. And inclusive user testing also means including older people too. Sometimes you're going to have people who are older who don't necessarily have unique usability issues from someone who's younger. However, as I mentioned earlier, we all deteriorate as we age, and so things like poor colour contrast or difficult to read typography is going to be sort of amplified and exaggerated that much more for people who are older. I think used correctly, inclusive personas is another way that can be a really powerful way of doing some work yourself to make sure that you consider people with different access needs. So with inclusive personas, it's just, again, thinking about how different customers might use products differently, either with different technology or experiencing and having different sort of challenges when using interfaces. They should be, of course, based on the demographic that you're working with, but it's not difficult to come up with some sort of different personas who have different needs from what you might consider is the norm. But when it comes to inclusive personas, there's a lot of really good examples out there. Not the easiest to remember catchy URL here, so I can share these slides afterwards. But Barclays have some good examples if you need some inspiration. And Government Digital Service have also got some really good inclusive personas that are worth checking out. Another really important thing to consider are sort of component and pattern libraries. The Government Digital Service released theirs in June last year. And what a component library is, for anyone who's unsure, is sort of a library that contains all the sort of building blocks of the web, everything from buttons to links and so on. And what they've done is made sure that they've internally reviewed them, but they've also tested them thoroughly with people who have different access needs. And it doesn't guarantee that if you then drag and drop these components into an interface that you're building, that it's going to have the perfect level of accessibility for everyone. But there's a good chance that it is going to be very accessible because it's already gone through some rigorous testing first. So if you haven't already got one, I'm sure lots of you do have your own. I can't stress enough how important it is to have a component library. I think particularly with larger organisations, one of the things I notice quite a lot is that a lot of designers and developers are given a bit too much free rein to sort of customise and reinvent the wheel when it comes to components that we commonly experience across the web. And if they're not semantically marked up or designed, this can create real challenges for people. What I'd like to do now is just finish with a quick video. I don't know if anyone's heard of voice control from Apple. This came out in the latest operating system in iOS 13. But I think it nicely illustrates a really nice feature which is inclusive, and I'll explain why afterwards.
Wake up. Voice control is a breakthrough feature that gives you full control of your devices, with just your voice, period. It's a whole new way to do everything you love, period. Like this. Correct love. 16. Open photos. Scroll up. Show numbers. 13. Click share. 3. Tim. Next field. Let's try this one today. Thumbs up emoji. Click send. Open maps. Show grid. Long press at 20. Open app switcher. 4. Tap share. Tap Tim. Tap send.
Hey, good to see you.
Open music. Turn up the volume.
All right.
So I'm sure as you can experience from that video how useful that would be for someone with motor disabilities. But it could be useful for anyone trying to write an email, for example, or do certain tasks when it's difficult using your hands. So, for example, I've had some problems with RSI recently, and from probably spending too much time on a phone. And tools like that can obviously be incredibly useful. Thanks a lot. Thanks for listening.
Very much, guys. That was brilliant.